Ladies and gentlemen, it has arrived. Inside this box is the brand new ITX case from Fractal Design, the Terra. And I've actually been very excited about this. I first saw this at Computex and I've been waiting eagerly to actually be able to make this video. And I'm so pleased that it's not only arrived, but the time to unbox and do a little build has come. And what better way to properly bless this build by opening this box with the cheapest IKEA scissors we could find. I mean, they do function. You can't say that they don't. Da, 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 da. Oh. I mean, Fractal have actually been on a roll recently with their ITX cases. We recently did a video all about the Ridge. You can find that in the top right corner of your screen. And I like the fact that that was quite different, but it wasn't necessarily the ITX case for everybody. Whereas this is very much going to be something that if you want to have a system you can show off without all of that RGB lighting, you want something that's going to be timeless and properly looks good, then clearly you're going to fall in love with this thing. I mean, look at this. It comes in 3 different colors. This is the jade green. You've also got the white and the black, and if it sells, I imagine they'll bring out some more. Let's see if it works, shall we? Right after a short word from this video's sponsor. Corsair's IQ Link is here to revolutionize your gaming PC. This brand new ecosystem stops cable clutter in its tracks, with interconnecting components removing the need for endless cables and giving you more control over your PC than ever before. Grab some interlocking QX RGB fans for dual light loop beauty, an H150i IQ Link cooler for next level CPU thermals, and connect up to a whopping 14 devices to a single IQ system hub. Learn more today with the link down below. But anyway, let's actually press on, shall we? We will be looking at the instruction manual in just a second, but I do want to see how obvious this is. I mean, the top panel comes off nicely. The paint is, of course, on both sides. It feels really nice and premium. This is one sheet of metal that's been sort of milled out. Very nice to see, but it might be that you need screws. Yes, I think you need screws, but they have actually been labeled here, look, with these little orange markers, so you do at least know what you need to take out. So let's remove this one, shall we? And we'll do the same with the other side. And then I believe the sides just fold out like that. Doing, of course, the same with the other side. And then it appears you are left with an open frame upon which to build. And this is obviously going to be brilliant for access because you just sort of move the whole thing around and build on top of it, right? There are some cases that are way more modular but require a lot more work, whilst there are some that less bits come off and then obviously it's very fiddly to actually get inside. So it's going to depend on the motherboard that you're using. I have actually used before in the 2000D video an ITX motherboard from Gigabyte, and it had loads on it, but you had to sort of have a load of different cables in splitters and adapters and things, and it just gets really messy. So I'm hoping that the one we're using here today is going to be a little bit more straightforward. I doubt it has as many features. This is a B650E board though, so perfect for gaming, loads of bandwidth on offer, but hopefully a little bit easier to cable manage. And one of the main selling points of this case, besides the obvious looks, is the fact that it is actually quite adjustable. So you have these little screw marks here, and if you do want to give yourself a little bit more room for like a wider GPU, then you can adjust it so you have more room for your GPU at the cost of your CPU cooling. But of course you can do the same the other way around. If you have like a lower profile or thinner GPU, you can swap it around so you can have a bigger and heavier CPU cooler. And this is pretty much the area that I'm going to struggle a little bit in this video because I'm going for worst case scenario, but I think you could get something bigger. We're going to use the Be Quiet Pure Rock LP. It says it's rated for 100 watts of power, and we're going to use a 65 watt chip with the Ryzen 7600, but obviously if you do want to go for something a little bit more beefy, maybe the 7700 or the 7800 X3D, make sure you're getting a cooler that's a little bit bigger so it can properly dissipate all of that heat. But let's start as always by opening up our motherboard and actually building this on top of the box. And it does look as if we're in luck because we do have a Wi-Fi antenna for the motherboard to obviously give it some Wi-Fi connectivity, but it doesn't appear that you need any of those horrible like adapter or things, splitter cables or anything, which is nice. I mean, there's not too much on this motherboard. You do actually have a blazing M.2 slot if you want to use a Gen 5 SSD, which is nice, but other than that, it's fairly bare bones for an ITX board. But as I say, personally, I think this is a good thing. Unless you have loads of drives and loads of fans and things that we're not going to have in here, I don't really think that's necessary. So this will actually save you a fair bit of hassle. And because this is a B650E motherboard, you do have PCI Gen support for both the graphics and the SSD. Very future-proof. Let's open up our slot though and grab our CPU. Again, this is a 65 watt chip, which is the main reason we're using it. 6 cores, fantastic for gaming, not the absolute best, but of course, because this is the AM5 platform, it is going to be very upgradable in the future. So if you do want to grab like a, I don't know, a 10 core Ryzen CPU that might release in like 2 years time, in theory, you should be able to grab a BIOS update and just drop this in. But of course, it is all going to be down to AMD and ultimately the thermal limitations of the cooling that you're going to add to your rig. We are, of course, also going to need some memory. This is some stuff from G-Skill, Trident Z5. This is actually an XMP kit that should work fine, but for best practice, I would always recommend grabbing an Expo kit. And if you haven't already noticed, this packs RGB. That is going to be pretty pointless in a case like this where you're not going to be able to see it. Save yourself some money. But if all goes to plan, this will be running at 6,000 megahertz though, which is super quick and is perfect for AMD Ryzen. 32 gigabytes of the stuff as well, but you can actually grab kits now that are 48, that if you're going for a very high-end rig on ITX might actually make more sense, because obviously you only have 2 slots, so it's not that upgradable. But that is in, so now it's time for our SSD. I'm really hoping the active cooling this isn't going to come on unless it's needed, because small fans do tend to get quite loud. But as this is a Gen 4 drive, you probably could, as long as you're monitoring it, take away or at least reduce the fan speed by quite a significant amount. Please don't forget to take this plastic peel off though, or you will be having problems. And then we can go ahead and actually grab the SSD itself. This is a new one, haven't used it before, Patriots P400. They did actually send some memory that was going to be used in this rig as well, but that was 7,600 megahertz, and with AMD it's just not going to like that. So we will use that another day and instead focus on our PCI Gen 4 drive. Probably not worth going for Gen 5 just yet. Depends on the pricing though. I've seen some decent ones from Crucial actually that are getting relatively affordable, but then at the same time you can get things like Samsung 980 Pros on offer, 1 terabyte for like $60 or so. So please don't spend loads of money on Gen 5 that you just don't really need. But let's go right ahead and drop this down into position, screw it back into place, and then we can go right ahead with our CPU cooler. And again, I'm not necessarily recommending this one, I just wasn't sure how much clearance we are going to have. So hopefully by the end of this video you'll have a better idea. This should be absolutely fine for this CPU, but I really wouldn't want to use like a X version or especially the X3D or anything with this. So just be careful with your choice of CPU cooler, and remember that I think you can put a 120 all-in-one in this, but it might get tight. Let's see if I can actually remember how to install this. No, I can't remember. Oh yeah, swap out the screws. I remember now. You have to do this one topsy-turvy. The screws sort of go down through the back plate. It is definitely worth noting, by the way, that this motherboard does have an extra SSD bay around the back. So that should be all ready to go now. I'm going to add some thermal paste as I've used this cooler before. I do like a divide symbol these days, just to make sure we get complete coverage. Then we're going to drop this down into place on top of those screws, and then see if you can screw this down into place. Easier said than done, actually. There is our CPU cooler attached. You can see why this is so low profile, because you barely have any room that it's extended the motherboard by. And I'd be very surprised if you couldn't get something a little bit bigger inside the chassis, but again, it does depend on the graphics card that you're going to go for. So if you're going to go for one that's very large, something like this is more realistic. But again, if you go for something that's maybe 2 slots, fairly short, then you could get away with a bigger CPU cooler. But let's get back now to the start of our show, the chassis. And I think this should be fairly easy to build in. As I say, it's very open. You can put a 2.5-inch SSD here. This power supply bracket will need to come out shortly when we install that. Obviously, graphics card sits here. If we were using an all-in-one liquid cooler, then we'd need a shorter GPU, and then this is where the 120mm fan and radiator would go. And then obviously our motherboard tray, the bit that we need now, is located over this side. So IO shield is already installed on this one, so it should just be a case of dropping it down. So let's get this unwrapped, pick up our motherboard and gently line this up with the back. It is really nice that our I/O is actually going to be accessible. Corsair 2000D. Let's grab our screws from the very helpfully labelled accessories box. So let's fit this down, take the cover off of our riser cable and just gently drop this into place till it clicks. And for those asking, yes, this is a Gen 4 riser cable. Then we can proceed to plug in all of our I/O. And actually, these cables are actually quite flexible, which is nice. The USB-C still is a little bit stiff, but ultimately when you bunch these down, tie them down, you shouldn't have a problem. I've seen cables before that are so stiff that it's really hard to actually get them to flex and then put the side panel on. So good marks there. Then we're going to need our power supply. It's kind of crazy how it feels like we've just got into this, and yet actually we're almost done. Hopefully. And the power supply that we're using is actually from Fantex. This is SFX, so it is obviously a lot smaller. You need one of these to properly fit in here. This is a 750 watt supply. This one's platinum rated, perfect for the GPU that we're using. But if you do want to put something like a, I guess potentially a 4090, it'd have to be a smaller one, but you get the point. If you're going to go for the top end GPU, you will need an 850 watt power supply. This will not be sufficient. And in order to get this power supply in, I think we just need to remove the bracket grab the power supply and place it on top. And you do have a few different options actually. You can either use this fan to help you sort of exhaust the heat of the GPU out and away, or you can do it the other way, which is going to be better for the power supply, but then obviously the GPU doesn't have like an active exhaust. Might be worth trying both. But I think I'm going to be nice to the power supply today and have the fan facing the CPU chamber. Plug in the power supply cables now, as it is going to make your life that little bit easier. And then now comes the potentially tricky bit of getting this into place. You're going to have to move cables out of the way as things get a lot tighter now. Maybe it's better to stand this up actually. There you go, just locks in like that. Getting a little bit fiddly now, but just screw this into place. And yeah, if you want to fit a fan down here at the bottom, you're going to have to contend with all of this. So while in theory it is definitely possible, don't go thinking it will be easy. Let's start plugging these things in, starting with the ATX power connection. If you've ever built a PC before, this is very standard stuff. Because our power supply is not actually at the back of our rig, we do need to plug this extension cable in, pre-routed for you. And then comes the moment you've been waiting for, the funnest part of any gaming PC, the graphics card. And this is one that was loaned out by AMD. This is the 7900 XT, and this is a fair bit lower power than the 7900 XTX. It's still very high end. This is going to give you fantastic frame rates in pretty much every game, even at 4K resolution. It's not going to be an RTX 4090, but I think in a rig like this, it does make a lot more sense. I mean, I actually use this for a portion in my own ITX rig. In fact, this has actually come out of that ITX rig, and it's been great. We just need to remove the thumb screws. Probably easier to do this lying down actually. Grab our GPU, line it up with the slot. Oh, we've got movement. Yes! I don't know why that was more difficult than it needed to be. I think actually the graphics card at the back slightly interferes with this PSU shroud. But otherwise, you do indeed actually have loads of space for your graphics card. This isn't even in the sort of pushed that way form factor. So if you do want to go for a larger GPU, then you can. Just be aware that if you are going for something like a Founders Edition, like this 4090 for instance, not saying this will necessarily go in here. I mean, I guess, it'd be tight, but I think you can just about get that in actually. But the problem is this is a pass-through card, so you are going to be chucking air into basically nothing. So I would advise having a power supply that was flipped around the other way so the fan could blow everything out, but then obviously you do risk overheating your power supply. So not really ideal for that either way. This is probably the right sort of high-end balance. It's also annoyingly fiddly actually to get these thumb screws back in because this bit blocks it. So you can take this off, but I mean, that's faff. Yeah, I think we're gonna have to take that off. Screws are out. There we go, that whole thing comes off. But now we can screw this into place. And unfortunately, this has now butted this power supply very close to the GPU. It's just because this has a backplate that sticks out a little bit. Most of them don't do this, but it is worth bearing in mind that if you have a thicker card on the top, this could also present some problems. And I'm not sure if there's a way to get around this problem actually, because you can of course move this whole thing to the left or to the right, but I'm not sure if you can actually do that individually. Let's feed our power supply cables in though, restore our backplate to where we found it, and then I think we're pretty much done. This is the Fractal Terra, built to what I would say is a very high-end standard. It's only that CPU that you could upgrade. I mean, clearly when it comes to graphics in terms of space, very little problems actually. It's a nice chamber. Obviously you are going to be restricted by the airflow a little bit. I mean, this is pretty good. It's fairly open, but there's still quite a lot of metal in there. It's not like it's thin mesh or anything, so do, of course, bear that in mind. But it's more when we come around to the other side that things get a little bit more interesting. Definitely not bad, but not perfect either. The CPU cooler here has actually turned out to be quite a good choice, but obviously, as we've already mentioned, if you're going for a higher TDP on the CPU, this isn't going to be sufficient. So, I don't know, it is a little bit limiting. You just need something that is going to potentially take up more space, something that covers your RAM a little bit, but doesn't extrude. Is that the right word? I think so. It doesn't extrude too much more out. I mean, you could move the whole thing the other side a little bit if you were struggling, but then you'd lose some of that GPU cooling. I mean, the only thing I'm a little bit baffled by is that in the manual for triple slot GPUs, they do say use a fan down the bottom. But I mean, you are going to have some special cables to be able to get this down there. There's no doubt about that. Oh look, I've just seen the logo etched neatly into the aluminium. That's really nice. But you know what would be nicer? Actually getting this, well, I guess set up and running. Can you go in? Yes, you can. Let's get this screwed back into place. Oh, I didn't even realize this. The whole thing will just swing up without needing to take the screws out. That's really useful actually, because if you do want to make some quick modifications or if something's not working, troubleshooting, swap out an SSD, you don't need to take anything apart. Let's put the last piece of the puzzle into place. And that was genuinely one of the easiest ITX builds I've ever done in my life. And when you consider how small this is, that is very impressive. I like this thing. I just hope that the thermals of this are actually going to be okay and noise levels as well, because as much as I love small form factor chassis, I think once you get down to this size, for me personally, unless you're going to do like some hardcore liquid cooling or something, you do start to get into limitations where the system is a little bit louder than you might like because the temperatures are higher because there's less airflow to actually go around. But having said that, it's doable, and if you're doing something like this where you're not using the highest end components, I think you might actually be all right. So let's find out. So in order to test this, we are of course going to need our keyboard, mouse, and the mouse mat. Don't forget, this is limited edition. Once we've sold out of this, that is it. We won't be producing any more. If you want to get your hands on this, it is gorgeous. The quality is, I mean, I was going to say to die for. I mean, I wouldn't personally die for a mouse mat. Maybe you would. Either way, grab yours today, and you don't have to, with a link down below. But let's get everything plugged in, and then it's time for the moment of truth. We have noise. Not that much noise, but it's wearing away. No RGB lights or anything here today, of course. I mean, I should be able to pop this open, right? So you can see, fans are spinning. Come on, come on. Oh, yes, yes, we made it. Excitement when ITX works is real. But yes, I am genuinely so happy with the Terra. I mean, again, thermals, we're testing in just a second. But build process, fantastic. Looks awesome. Build quality, great. I mean, price, $180 or so. It's definitely not going to be the cheapest thing out there, but I imagine the volumes of this are relatively lower than most cases. It's machined aluminum. It's machined aluminum for you Americans out there, so obviously build quality is very strong. Feels nice, looks good. I'm really struggling to fault it at the moment, other than the fact that it is ITX and obviously does limit you in terms of noise levels, potentially thermals, and obviously how much stuff you can actually fit inside here. But if you're happy with that, it looks pretty darn fine. But anyway, through the magic of editing, we have Windows installed and we have some games set up and ready to go, because we do actually want to test out thermals, acoustics, and of course give you an idea of performance. And I will actually start by saying that I'm very impressed with how well this copes with a 65-watt CPU, because there's not really too much noise to report when you're just using this in the desktop, which is really quite cool. I mean, if we swap over to the gameplay now so you can actually see what's going on, this is Returnal running at absolute max settings, including ray tracing at 4K resolution, and we're currently getting around about 50 to 60 FPS. So this really is a little powerhouse. This is using, I suppose, a fair amount of power, especially on that GPU, 65 watts on the CPU, and in terms of noise levels, I mean, there's barely anything. Like, I didn't expect this. I honestly thought we were going to have a fantastic build experience and the whole system was going to look great, but it was going to make a fair bit of noise. But I'm really pleased to say that that's not the case. I mean, I am still slightly concerned about the CPU cooling if you are going to go for something that's a little bit bulkier with, I don't know, like over 100 watts of TDP. But if you are going to use one of these new non-X CPUs from AMD, I think they're going to be the right choice really, because clearly what you're able to achieve here is very impressive. I mean, what's that? 99% utilization on the GPU, and then around about 11 or so on the CPU. Temperatures definitely aren't the best on that CPU, but I have set a custom fan curve on this, so take it with a little bit of a pinch of salt. And I wouldn't necessarily describe this as a problem, more of an observation, but when you do have this running games or anything really that does properly heat this system up, be aware that the top panels, and to be fair, the side panels as well, do get quite warm. I mean, not necessarily enough to burn you, it's almost acting as a bit of a heat sink as well, but maybe don't rest it up against anything, including your hands for a long period of time. Ow. But let's go right ahead and do some more thorough testing by trying a game that is a lot more dependent on the CPU. So you can see that utilization now has increased. What's that, about 44% or so on the processor now, and you can see that the thermals have increased to around about 88 degrees. So this isn't necessarily ideal. Again, you probably could get that fan to spin a little bit faster, but this is going to be limited. So for a gaming PC, I personally don't have a problem with this, but if you are going to be using this for like long-term rendering or something like that, where you're putting a lot of stress on your processor for a long period of time, then you will want to make sure that you do get a different cooler, maybe move it across a little bit internally just to give yourself more space to have a larger CPU cooler. But again, it is absolutely insane that you can have a system this small yet run something like Planet Zoo at 100 frames a second at 4K max quality settings. It is pretty wild. Get it? Pretty wild? Because it's a zoo. And because I know I will get complaints if I don't show something multiplayer, here is some Apex Legends. This is running once again at 4K, and we're currently getting 144 FPS because the frame rate cap is currently enabled here. We're using about 70 to 80% of the GPU. More intense areas, you're probably looking at 90, 95. But this really does clearly show that it doesn't matter what resolution you want to play Apex Legends, clearly getting over 150 FPS is going to be easy. This is a pretty stellar gaming rig. There is one more test that I really think we need to do though, and that is to launch some Cinebench and put some proper stress on this CPU. How are we going to do for thermals? We're hitting 95 degrees at the moment, which isn't really that surprising to be honest. I imagine we might see some thermal throttling. If we go down to our clock speed, it's sitting okay actually, around about 4,650 or so. So while I actually wouldn't hesitate to recommend what we've got on offer here if you're just going to be playing games, if you're going for something with sustained CPU load, do look at getting a larger CPU cooler, or alternatively, if you were able to forgo some of the graphics card, then obviously you could go for an all-in-one 120 on the right here. That probably would give you much larger space, a much larger surface area of cooling potential if you like, because you sort of bring all the heat round and chuck it out the back. But you get the point. You are going to be limited, but as we've demonstrated, it can work rather well. There we are then, the Fractal Terra, a case that would have had a brilliant title for this video if it was bad. This case is terrible, but fortunately for me and fortunately for you, it is not. And in fact, this is one of my new favorite ITX cases that you can buy. And I'm actually someone that hates multiple favorites, but the form factor obviously means that there are so many different variables at play that you can't just have one favorite. I mean, I still think for me, the Meshlicious is the best all-round ITX case. You can fit a little bit more in, including that 240 all-in-one. That does make it easier, if you like, to balance out thermals and compatibility and having as much hardware in here that you want. But having said that, as long as you are okay with the limitation on the CPU side, I think this is a pretty darn little tasty ITX case. And if I was still doing awards, I'd give this the editor's choice. But sorry, Fractal, we don't have any. Let me know your thoughts on this. Is this the sort of ITX case that you've had your eyes on, if you like, for ages, or do you prefer something bigger or maybe something smaller? Let me know down in the comment section below. Smash the like button if you've enjoyed this. Get yourself subscribed. If you do want to check out current pricing on the Terra, you can find this linked down below in all of those beautiful colors. And of course, while you're down there, why not bask in the beauty of Corsair's new IQ Link? This smart ecosystem eliminates those pesky RGB and fan cables from your system, allowing you to stack RGB devices with a smile. All the devices can be automatically set up and configured in IQ with some exclusive effects, and the new QX RGB fans even have a temperature sensor inside them for monitoring air temps. Get yours today with the link down below. Thank you so much for watching this video. We'll catch you in the next one.